At the dawn of the 20th century, immigrants flocked to the shores of America. Fleeing the economic and political hardships that plagued a weary Europe, they came seeking better lives for themselves and their families. Even in the midst of a Great Depression, these newly arrived citizens embraced their adopted land. The promise of America, the idea that anyone, regardless of class or circumstance, could rise to prosperity through ingenuity and determination, was an ever-present beacon of hope for themselves and for their children. It was the next generation, bred with old world values, but born and educated as Americans, who would truly build upon the foundations of liberty and opportunity. And while many of the children of immigrants found success, a few exceeded all expectations, even to the point of adding new threads to the hardy fabric of American free enterprise. One of these is Albert J. Amatuzio. Al took a proven technology, synthetic lubrication, and applied it in an entirely unique way. And from this one revolutionary idea, a new company was born. Countless lives have been enriched, and an entire industry has been transformed. But Al Amatuzio's road has been a long and undulating climb. His path arcs from a hardscrabble immigrant neighborhood to the fringes of Earth's atmosphere, and finally, to the boardroom of a global manufacturing and distribution enterprise. He has faced hardship, skepticism, and crisis, and met every challenge with a trademark blend of dogged determination and tireless optimism.
A lot of people would have been content with being a lieutenant colonel in the Minnesota Air National Guard and a pilot who competed with the best in all of the military.
But he had a dream. And it is rare to find someone with a dream like that, fighting all the odds.
He was being resisted by everybody and everything.
And you don't tell Al you can't do it. You just don't tell him that.
Al had tremendous faith in the fact that synthetic oil was eventually going to become a very big factor in the marketplace.
And it's only because of Al Amatuzio that the industry has grown like it is.
That's the American dream. You know, you start from scratch and you build up a company. I think it's amazing.
Al Amatuzio's story is one of vision and resolve, challenge and patriotism, innovation, and, in the end, realization of the dream that caused so many to seek new and distant shores.
It was a rough and tumble neighborhood, and those families that grew up down there, they knew how to fight and play and probably do a few things under the table and a little gambling and a little booze, and it had strong old country influences. They were sort of proud of it, actually.
Definitely, there was a pride in your ethnic background, your ethnic heritage. And that was one of the things that I think helped meld the community together. The people understood that somebody, the next house or two houses away, was a different ethnic group. And you learned to appreciate and, if not understand them totally, you knew that they came from a different background. And the people learned to get along with each other.
They would share and exchange vegetables out of their gardens, for example. They all knew the parents, the grandparents, the kids, and they kind of, in some respect, maybe even looked out for each other.
Far from Duluth, Minnesota's East End mansions and hillside thoroughfares, the Raleigh Street neighborhood developed along the muddy fringes of the city's industrial harbor. Here, during the early to mid-1900s, Poor Italian, Serbian, and Austrian families lived together in a safe and cooperative community that was in sharp contrast to the neighborhood's dangerous reputation. In fact, it was because of Raleigh Street's collective poverty that bedrock American values prevailed.
I think the big word that describes it is the close-knit families that grew up in hardship and became very, very close, had very, very high expectations for their children.
They worked around the steel plant, that worked in the foundries down there, and they weren't used to just things handed to them. They worked, and I think that carried through with a lot of those people down there.
They were immigrants, and because the people of long standing in the community kind of looked down their nose at them, they got the menial jobs. But their offspring then progressed through the education system and worked themselves into a better standard of living.
In the early 1920s, one of the families living in the Raleigh Street neighborhood was headed by Albert and Margaret Amatuzio. The young couple shared a strong Italian heritage.
Our mother and dad both migrated from Italy. My dad, I'm told, arrived in Duluth when he was 4 years old, my mother when she was 6 years old. And they met because they were neighbors.
In May of 1924, Margaret Amatuzio gave birth to her fourth child and second son. From the moment he entered the world, it was clear that challenge would be part of this child's experience.
He was born in a home there with a midwife and a neighbor lady were there. When he was born, he came out and he wasn't breathing. And the midwife worked on him and there was no life, and worked on him and gave up, thought he was not going to make it, and he was dead.
And his neighbor lady, Mrs. Puglisi, said, she wouldn't take that for an answer, and so she worked on him and put him in cold water and warm water and lifted him up and down and whatever, and he said that her reward was that he wept all over the front of her, and when the doctor saw that, he thought, my goodness, this baby is alive.
Like his father, the boy was named Albert. But rather than call him Junior, his family adopted an even more descriptive nickname.
He was supposedly was going to be the last member of the family, and because he was called Babe.
He was Babe to me till I was about 12 or 13, and then I started hearing him mentioned as Albert, and I'm thinking, who the heck is this Albert? Is that a member of the Amatuzio family that I wasn't even aware of? His real given name is Albert, but he was always Babe.
From the beginning, young Al was filled with seemingly inexhaustible energy and constantly sought to expand the boundaries that defined his world.
He tells a story that my grandmother used to have to tie him to the sewing machine so that she could keep an eye on him, otherwise he would run off and never know what kind of trouble he would get into. He was very mischievous.
He took a tire and he rolled it all the way up the stairs to the top floor of where they lived, and he let it go. Crash! And the neighbors would come and they'd say, Margaret, your son, Albert. And he'd say, no, Mama, not me. It wasn't me, Mom.
Raleigh Street was the perfect anvil for forging a young boy's character. On the rough and tumble streets, Al developed a scrappy and resourceful persona. But the camaraderie and family values that governed the close-knit neighborhood also cultivated loyalty and respect.
It was a neighborhood where you had to learn to, in the education system, accept what the teachers, what the educators put forth to you, and accept their discipline. Because if you didn't accept their discipline, and word got home that you didn't accept the discipline in the schools, you got the discipline at home.
My mother was the one that made us demanded respect, that we respect our elders, that we respect everybody. And my dad would back my mother up completely.
Al's father, Albert Sr., had a compact but formidable frame. 5'9", 190 pounds, with a 17-inch neck, 45-inch chest, and 30-inch waist. Once, while playfully wrestling a much larger co-worker, he accidentally crushed 6 of the man's ribs. Throughout all of West Duluth, his strength was the stuff of legend.
He had this brute strength, and this is something that was born, it was in his genes. And people didn't mess with him because, he could take down 2 or 3 people at a time.
He worked at the inland coal dock as a foreman or assistant foreman, and when he would go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, he would walk over the railroad tracks to get to work, and he knew the men that were working at the railroad tracks, and they would have these large rails to move, and they couldn't move these rails, and they would wait for him to come in the morning. And when he would come down with his lunch pail, they would say, "Al, would you help us move this rail?" So he would tell the 4 or 5 of them to go to one end, he would get at the other end, and they would lift this rail up and move it to where they wanted. This was the strength he had.
In spite of Albert Sr.'s imposing physical prowess and being the family breadwinner, there was never any doubt that the Amatuzio household was a matriarchy. Whether meting out discipline to the children or setting the course for their collective future, the firm hand on the family tiller belonged to Margaret, also known as Marge.
She was a very determined woman that she was not only going to succeed, but her kids were going to.
A strong person. Marge was very well read. She loved to read. She would read books. She'd read all the time.
God, she could tell you presidents. She could name every one of them, back from the first one all the way. And she says, "You want me to do it forward or backwards?" She could tell you that. Just amazing woman.
To the chagrin of his mother and father, local doctors and hospitals developed a regular familiarity with the spirited young Al. He seemed determined to do everything fast and to the limit, even if it meant a few broken bones. And so one day, when he suddenly stopped moving altogether, it could only mean that something was seriously wrong.
He was at a movie, and his brother Don, his older brother Don, was sitting in front of him. And the movie was over with, and it was time to go, and Al couldn't get up out of his seat. And so his brother carried him home. They didn't know what was wrong with him, and so his mother called the doctor.
And the doctor came over to the house, as Al tells the story, and he said, "He's not going to make it. He's not going to make it." And she says, "The heck, and she got a hold of the cab driver that was out there, and a cab driver picked up Al and threw in the cab and brought him out, got him to the hospital."
And Al said he remembers the cab driver carrying him into the hospital and putting him on the gurney that was there, and then he blacked out.
Al had developed rheumatic fever, a potentially life-threatening illness. Months in the hospital followed. Luckily, the disease never affected his heart or kidneys. Nor did it dampen his indomitable spirit. By the time he reached adolescence, an innate entrepreneurial drive was already in full gear. In the beginning, however, it was an enthusiasm fueled by necessity.
He always needed money, and he would pull many angles to get his hands on a couple of coins. He was quite an entrepreneur from that point of view. Not that it was in a malicious sense, but in a sense of trying to go out and have a good time and have some fun. He was really a very fun-loving young man who just loved being with people.